The real book we're going to talk about today is this one, Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis by Jacques Lacan. In this book he outlines four concepts which he considers to be central to psychoanalysis, and I thought this was a great place to start getting into Jacques Lacan and his brand of psychoanalysis. Now, the four concepts are the unconscious, repetition, transference, and the drives. And today we're just gonna stick with the unconscious because that's a tricky topic in and of itself, and hopefully I can turn this into a series of sorts. Two things Jacques Lacan says about the unconscious is that one, it is structured like a language, and two, because of this structuring of the unconscious, it is a thing we can demarcate, it is a thing we can turn into an object of study, it's a thing we can analyze, and it's a thing we can define, despite its very elusive nature. When Jacques Lacan says it's structured like a language, he doesn't mean it is a language. You can't speak unconscious. What he means is that it obeys certain rules like language does. Language has to obey syntax and grammar, and the unconscious has similar things it has to go by. It has similar games it has to play. And secondly, Jacques Lacan isn't talking about language in the way that we talk about natural languages, English, Spanish, Pali, Sanskrit, etc. He's talking about a more broader symbolization of things. One which includes words and sentences and numbers and lines, dots and dashes, but one which includes everything else. He's talking about the symbolic order or the symbolic register, which is a thing you're sort of situated in already prior to your birth. Before you were born, you were sort of situated into the world linguistically. You were given a name, you were given a social security number, people set up a room for you, they imagined what their lives would be with you in it. And then when you are born, you start off by screaming, you start off by crying. That is the way you communicate the best, that is the only way you know how to communicate. And people, your parents, oftentimes have to go in, have to interpret what it is that you feel. So your parents have to retroactively define what your emotion was, what your need was, what your lack was. And this process is what thrusts their language onto you. A language you didn't decide to sort of adopt, but one which is thrust upon you, forced upon you. You have to do it in order to make yourself communicable. But the thing about this language is that it is something you inherit. You didn't define the words, you didn't come up with the ways you can sort of compose a sentence. You can't express yourself fully and accurately because it is an inherited language. And this is a form of castration, a certain frustration felt by you because you are denied desire. The reality principle succeeds over your pleasure principle. So, what are the rules the unconscious has to obey? Well, there are two fundamental games it plays according to Jacques Lacan. One is that of condensation. Condensation is very well described by Sigmund Freud in the interpretation of dreams. He describes it as a primary psychic process in which something that causes us anguish, something that causes us anger, aggression, fear, what have you, is manifested to us in a condensed way. This could be literally in form. Dreams seem to go by quicker, they seem shorter. You probably only remember like 10 minutes of a dream or 15 minutes of a dream, even though you've probably dreamt for hours. A very good and concrete example of this is, for example, if you have a fear of wolves, or if you fear that you might lose your job and you, by extension of that, fear your boss, those two things might come into play in a condensed form in your dream. For example, as a grotesque monster, having the eyes of your boss, or having the paws of the wolves, etc. This seems like a silly thing, but it is a way for the unconscious to manifest itself in a condensed form in your dreams. And the other way the unconscious operates is through displacement. Displacement is the process in which something gets shifted from one place to another place. So, if you fear wolves, if you fear your boss, they might occur in your dream, they might manifest themselves in your dream, but they won't be the cause of your distress. There might be something else in your dream which causes you distress, maybe a pair of shoes, maybe a chair, maybe a table. And you might wake up the next day and think to yourself, why was that such a cause of distress? Why did I fear the table? Why was that such a thing in my dream? Now, Jacques Lacan actually goes in and interprets these things. He says condensation is much like a metaphor and displacement is much like a metonymy. Both the metaphor and the metonymy are ways of displacing what is actually causing you anxiety and fear, etc. And this wasn't lost on Jacques Lacan. He actually wrote quite a lot about it. And in order to really recognize this, we have to talk very briefly about the sign. The sign basically consists of two things. One is the signifier, which is the thing we actually say. I can say cat, dog, table, what have you, and that is a signifier. Whenever I speak, whenever I use words, I use a chain of signifiers in order to construct a sentence. The other part of the sign is the signifié, the signified, which is actually the concept of what we're talking about. When I say dog, an image of a dog lights up in your brain. You think about a certain dog, but you might think of another dog than I would think about. And in these signifieds are our concepts of them. Do we like dogs? Do we dislike dogs? Do we think them to be evil? Do we think them to work in a certain way? For Ferdinand de Saussure, the sign was a fixed thing between the signifier and the signifieds. But the signified to Jacques Lacan tends to shift. It tends to glide. An example of this is if you are in school. The teacher is trying to explain to you a concept of something and you don't quite understand what the teacher is getting at. So you raise your hand and you say, can you try explaining it in a different way? And of course the teacher will try to explain it to you in a different way, and eventually you'll probably get what it is the teacher is trying to convey. But when you ask the teacher, can you try explaining it to me in a different way, what you're actually saying, according to Lacan, is, can you try using another set of signifiers in order to convey your ideas? Thus a word, a concept, a signifier always tends to glide in a signifying chain, as Jacques Lacan calls it, because inside a word, inside a concept, are many other different concepts. And these can only be grasped at, through exclusion, through differentiation. A cat is a cat because it is not a dog, an armadillo, or whatever. The signifying chain is the symbolic order. This chain that trots along with all of these signifiers is how this symbolic order, the symbolic register, actually functions. So, and whenever this happens, especially in the question of traumas and of ills, certain gaps will appear in the chain. Jacques Lacan refers to this as breakdowns in language, pause, gaps, interruption, slits, discontinuity. And these are breakdowns in language. And that is why an analysand receives therapy. She or he might have trouble putting everything into words, have trouble symbolizing everything. Traumas and symptoms and general ills, all of these things are hard to sort of get at. And that is what psychoanalytic therapy is. It's a talking cure. It is trying to symbolize the things that cannot be put into words. It's trying to incorporate the real into the symbolic order. The real is what lies outside of the symbolic order. It's not something that comes before it. It's not something that is transcendent to it, goes beyond the symbolic order. It is something that can only be described by the symbolic order. So it is basically a state of being without language. And Jacques Lacan actually uses the Aristotelian word psyche in order to refer to the encounter with the real. And that is the job of the therapist. It is to make interventions, to intervene whenever the patient, the analysand, is doubting, is uncertain. And this intervention could be to just ask questions about it, ask the analysand to talk about them, or ask the analysand to make these free associations. And this unfolding of the signifying chain is what Jacques Lacan refers to with the Aristotelian word automaton. The way the unconscious works, the way the signifying chain works, is through substitution. The substitution of signifiers, the cycling through the different signifiers, establishes an equivalence between non-identical things. And we'll talk much more about this in the next video, where we'll talk about the second fundamental concept of psychoanalysis, repetition. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to let the conversation continue in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye, Felicia. Mwah.